All right, and we are back for another exciting week of GPS Live. Hello, everybody tuning in online, and hello, my name is Jonathan Singer, and I have with me,
Hey everybody, it's Felix Simmons. Nice meeting
hey,
you.
Felix. Thanks for joining this week, man. How are you doing? How are things going?
No, things are going great, man. It's been a pretty good week. I'd say working on some cool engagements and just kind of just, pretty good week in the background.
Nice, nice. As we say over here, hacking the planet and all those other great things. I myself had quite the exciting week. It has been crazy. The weather here in Tampa has been raining every single week, and it's nuts. And we even tried to have you on the show before, and it sounds like something came up.
Oh yeah, no, I was the dividing line between the flooded out houses and the non-flooded out houses. Like my across the street neighbors were flooded. I was not, but our internet connectivity and power kept coming in and out. So yeah, right before we were getting ready to go on, I was like, "Singer, I have no internet and I have no power. I'm gonna die on the battery before we finish this." So
Oh man, well, I'm so glad you were able to join us this week because we have a really cool lineup this week. As we were talking before the show about some of the great stories, so we'll introduce it as this is GPS Live for the week of September 2nd, 2022. For those tuning in live online, please feel free to jump into the chat at any time, and for those in the future, hello. Uh, like all good things, let's go ahead and make sure that everybody understands that the views and opinions expressed by the host and live stream are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official opinions of GuidePoint Security. Now that we have that out of the way, um, we really do. We have some really cool stuff lined up for this week, let's kick this off. I'll kind of jump right into the first story, and this is something that I personally I'm really interested in. I'm a fan of bug bounties. I've played my fair share, and so the story coming to us this week from The Verge is about Google taking steps to add bug bounties for open source projects. Right? They want to help with supply chain, and so some of the things that you and I are talking about is like all these applications are made up of so many other things that affect it downstream, right? For instance, I mentioned like something like OpenSSL. Like, how many things actually have that? What are you, what are you gonna dive in and try to get the 31337 award?
I think the funniest thing about like everything going on with open source right now is like this doesn't get enough news as it should. I think what Google is doing is really going to flip things. I think every major organization that I know of leverages open source libraries, they leverage open source components. And so, like, historically, it's always been a very one direction kind of contribution, right? The open source community has done a lot, and especially in app dev, like when you really start to look at any modern app running on Angular or any other major framework, like it's all stitching together a lot of open source. And so what Google's doing is really trying to get in front of what we're seeing out there. I mean, everybody's running some sort of SCA tool to figure out what kind of library vulnerabilities they have and what the dependencies of dependencies are going for. But like I think that's one piece of it. But what Google's doing is going at it at the source. And I think there's been enough uh, apathy towards the actual projects themselves. And it's not for lack of trying. I know the community uh, volunteerism only goes but so far, right? Like there's a lot of very strong projects that are actively maintained, but there's also some that are they infrequently get touched. And so anything that could drive those forward and get some vulnerability visibility, I think it's a major win, right? So
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, right? Like you said, almost everybody has some form of open source software, whether they know it or not. Like that's even the craziest part is that, a lot of people are relying off of this, like this COTS, software suites, right? The stuff that they're just buying retail and they're installing it and they're full, even though the product itself may be like a closed source piece of software, which most is going to be, they're still full of these libraries, right? And that's where Google is trying to focus. They're saying that even Google themselves, like just like any other big business, they're made up of all these other projects, right? They, for instance, they mentioned stuff like Angular and Golang and Fuchsia, but also the dependencies of those projects and those code bases, and that they want to award people. And what's actually even cooler is people that don't necessarily want the money. Google will double their reward for a charity, right, as a donation on top of it. Like it's good support.
Yeah, and it's crazy too. Like, we've had some decently high profile open source things that have happened in the passage, just to kind of show the relationship between open source and closed source. Like when there was a Node developer, it was I think it was the Node IPC package. He
Mhm.
during the Ukraine war, like he deleted his package, and all of these downstream dependencies were impacted because it was fairly popular of a package, and so like we've seen examples of that time and time again where something like that happens, whether protest or otherwise, or sometimes malicious actors get access to certain things, and we've seen that play out. But like it's the quick react that people have to do once those things happen that just kind of show the relationship. So like
Yeah.
rather than being reactive when that stuff happens, I mean, I think from a vuln perspective, get in front of that. Any sort of bug bounty for those things that everybody uses is solid. Um, I was kind of talking with you offline there a little earlier, and I think one of the things in this space that's interesting to me is like when you look at like the dominant licenses like MIT or PPL or any of the licenses out there, like I think there's businesses are incentivized to do things, and their goal is for the most part a lot of times profit. And so if you don't have incentives, then there's no reason to. So I've always wondered why there wasn't like an open source license that just called out for some small contributions from the closed source community that uses them just a little bit. But I don't know. Who knows? It's up to you
Hey,
guys.
that's a message I can get behind. And you mentioned it, or you hit the nail on the head. I think sometimes it's like these repositories that can get compromised, and it's it flows upstream. This is a big reminder to our listeners that the term supply chain often historically may have referred to something of physical or tangible means, but in our world, supply chain is the libraries and source code that you pilfer. Right? I'm not saying go on Stack Exchange and start copy pasting everything you see, but yeah, these are parts of our applications that we use every single day. I mean, if anybody, you pop into one of those help about menus, you'll see that there's attribution to all of these other open source projects and open source parties that are just deeply embedded in our day-to-day lives. And so I may jump back into the bug bounty game a little bit and see if I can poke around and find some stuff, especially now because the whole breadth of what you can target is even wider.
Yeah, 100%. I know. I'm firing up Zap right now. So
Oh, we fired up. There you go, dude. I love it. I love it. And man, what? I'm gonna go get Zap going too. Um, I think this is good. And any of our viewers online too, if you are looking at all considering open source stuff, like what are you doing? It's just hopefully this gets some people thinking that our programs are made up of other programs, and those programs have a tendency to uh, to have potential vulnerabilities. And so let's make this world a safer place online.
yeah.
Um, Talking about safer place online, I think that's a really good segue to get into our next story. And so just the other day, I decided to order some dinner from my wife and I using one of those apps, and it was hand delivered by an individual, and it happens to be part of the gig economy. But what happens when the gig economy turns into cybersecurity and black hat hacking and cyber crime, right? Um, and so, having poke around this one coming to us from Forbes is the fact that there is an entire gig economy that has kind of grown in this space. What did you get out of this article?
So like I always go back to like what's old is new and what's new is old. I think it's the natural progression of things that have been out there, right? Like so when you look at back in the day, you used to have like punter services because you wanted to kick somebody off an online game, and like you could that turned into, okay, now if I can take them out, I can take out maybe a corporation and DDoS. And then it was always trading of records, and there were always varying prices for records. But I think when you fast forward to now, the structure and organization that's behind what's going on is these are operating like businesses. These are people going into cubicles sometimes, and in some ways presenting up services that make them money, right? So I think when you look at the ease of interaction, it's become to a point where it's almost like they're acting as if it's above board operations, but just so happens it plays out in a little bit more closed communities. But yeah, no, I think it's just a sign of kind of like everybody's trying to look for the way through the changing of how work processes, right? So if you look on the straight side of things, like the remote workforce is real. You've got people that historically didn't necessarily have remote options, or are now starting to look at other things like fiber and elance and all of those. So why should the bad guys have to go into the office, right? So I think it's just a natural progression. I think it's going to flare up, and the world's going to open back up like it is doing right now. And I think we'll see this just stick around, just like the what is it, the what are they calling everybody not going back into work? It's I don't know, whatever the
Oh,
term is.
like
Yeah,
I don't know, like the whole remote work generation, something of the sort. Like,
yeah.
no, this is kind of the direction we're going in, right? And to kind of pivot off of the open source, I mean, there are individuals around the world that make a solid living on bug bounties
Hmm.
and hacking companies legally, and discovering great vulnerabilities and documenting them and submitting them. And I mean, there's a lot of people seriously making six figures doing this kind of stuff on a daily basis. But imagine if you flip the table from good people doing good things to what may have been good people but now doing bad things, it seems like, as a service. And we've covered stories about things like ransomware as a service, and cyber crime in general. But this is now like the true definition of hacker for hire,
Hmm.
where you can find people to target websites, target devices like phones and laptops, target individuals, and get kind of like that open source intelligence, and then some records and emails and even denial of service. Like, these are all services that people, not necessarily like a cybercrime organization that we may have been accustomed to, right? We've seen these with ransomware, where it's an office and people and support. This is just random folks online trying to make a quick buck, but
Yeah,
doing it in a nefarious way.
yeah, and when you look at like crime orgs like this, very very often crime orgs mimic what real organizations are. I mean, if you look at a lot of the phishing and the email scam orgs, I mean they mimic corporations. When you look in the non cyber realm, like if you look at like most crime organizations, after a while they started to mimic the structure of corporations with like executive boards and leaderships and a structure to it that like plays out. I mean, that the form of a corporation is something that just gives kind of strength through different layers of leadership, and so crime orgs have just kind of mimicked that too. So I mean, this is no different. This is the Uber Eats of crime, right? So like I think that's kind of how things trend. So
It is. It's on demand. It's bidding for the lowest price for a gig, for a job. And it's one of the interesting things is that it's still very much the Wild West. One of the call outs in the article talks about how both buyers and sellers need to be aware, right? What if a buyer is really just a law enforcement agency trying to do a sting operation? And equally, what if the sellers are offering a service and it's like a pay up front thing, like, can't give me Bitcoin now, or else I'm not going to do this. And then they just disappear because that's the internet. And
yeah,
oftentimes these are, conversations taking place in what is considered like a dark web, right? Places of the internet that aren't necessarily indexed, that aren't necessarily easily accessible, right? Stuff like Tor and things of that nature. Um, and so it's kind of a little bit of a an like this whole just absence of law and order in the sense, and people are just getting away with whatever. But definitely, on the list of considerations, right, for any organization, that hire a hacker as a concept is even more prevalent now than it has been. So,
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I
um,
think there's been some interesting FBI, like when they uh, come in and then shutter some of these dark forums, like they're starting to basically keep them up and just kind of. I think they just recently had I think it was Operation Trojan Shield, I think, and they took down like 179 arrests in that one, just from keeping the forum up and letting things go, and feeling it out as far as they needed to make cases. So it's interesting. It's a cat and mouse on both sides there for sure.
and I know there's equally like a lot of services that put a lot of put effort into monitoring a lot of these forums for when your company may be advertised as a potential target, right? I have data on them, or I have a backdoor in this company who wants to buy access or rent access. Even I've seen happening these days, and so the whole industry of it, right? From a defensive perspective, we still need to do a lot of things that we're supposed to be doing today when it comes to things like continuous monitoring and detection, right? And focusing on, not that if this happens to us, but when it does, how are we going to handle it, right? I always hate to pitch it in that kind of light, but that does tend to be the reality with it. Right? We see this, you and we see this on a daily basis
Hmm.
of individuals being affected by these kinds of things. I wonder what the next generation is going to be like, right? Are we going to see more of this freelance approach? Are we going to see some of these individuals kind of teaming up to be that next, malware company out of some place that isn't going to stop them, kind of turn a blind eye because they get their cut? Um,
Yeah.
are they going to be driving Lambos?
Yeah, I think one thing I can definitely see happening more and more is like, if you go back a decade, right? Like if malware found its way on an endpoint, people would take a quick look, they triage, they'd rebuild, right? And so I think like the role of buying access into organizations, that was the mid 2000s. People started not just going like, hey, I've got a botnet that I'm going to use for my own purposes. It's like, now I have access into these IP spaces that are associated with these organizations. And so I think now the only thing that's going to further proliferate is like, instead of just having the access, I think being able to understand what's present on those things and looking into, in a more automated fashion, what they have toeholds in, and what they're able to compromise in terms of data and everything. I think that's going to be way more automated as things progress. Because I mean, if you look at CPU cycles of an average workstation now, the processing power is just going up, and for the use case of crunching data, SSDs make it so you don't even really realize your disk is going. You're not getting the same slowness. So I think there's definitely just going to be just further automations that happen as things progress. So
I completely agree. I see it too. Is a clever hacker can get in, but an even smarter one can automate a lot of their duties and multitask almost seems like. And so, to all the listeners out there online and watching in the future, right? This just expands the breadth of people that could potentially harm your organization, whether it's targeted or it's something you just stumble across and click the wrong link or email, and so more of a reason to step that cyber defensive game up. How about this? Do you want to help segue into our next story of the day?
yeah,
Since you definitely, when we were talking before the show, had a lot of interest in this particular one, so I'll let you lead us in.
yeah. So the other article is about new cybersecurity regulations that are coming through. Uh, I think when we start to look at the world right now, right? So I think once the executive order 14028 came out, as a result of a lot of things, but Colonial Pipeline's pushing it over the edge. I think that was the first inroads. That's, hey, public private should work together closer. OT is important. Certain things are critical infrastructure, and certain things should be viewed that way, differently than just the fact that they're running services and that they're used by a lot of the population. I think that happened. I think one of the things that was intriguing to me also was not just critical infrastructure but critical software, and I think that goes back
Mhm.
to our initial conversation around like some of the open source components. I think when you start to look at what's deemed critical software, that's going to be interesting to watch as regulations come through. Um, we used to always joke around like how many people are PCI compliant and get popped, or how many people are HIPAA or high trust or insert whatever here and get popped, and it's real because like one of the things that the article talked about was the focus of regulations historically has been on privacy, right? You look at GDPR, you look at most of the things that are out there. It's really on the data and the privacy elements of the data. Uh, I think I think if you look at fast forward to maybe some new regulation focused on cybersecurity, that's gonna be interesting. Like I'm a big firm believer in the law of unintended consequences. So like anytime regulations come through, there's always some stuff that you never would have guessed, but it just starts to happen, and the market acts around that. And so, when we start to look for what are the behaviors we want to incentivize in large organizations and small organizations, there's a few things that like need to. I think basic hygiene is something that like security hygiene is something that there are elements of that that can be regulated, and I think we'll see some of that happen, but I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? Yeah.
So, you mentioned something really interesting, and the article does call this out, is like the colonial pipeline, just as an example in the scenario that has, kind of sparked a lot of the conversation. And what the article was specifically saying is that, currently there was no need to actually report it to any kind of government entity because no personal information was disclosed, although the fact that an entire business and infrastructure was directly affected by it. And so, the question now becomes is, well, hold on a minute. This was a very serious case, but under current rules, there's no need to do it. So, how do we determine then what we need to start considering to be disclosed, right?
Mhm.
And there's still kind of like a delicate balance as we figure this out, right? Is every single time somebody does a port scan on you, many people may still consider that an active threat, but does that mean that the damage was done in a passive manner versus you know, do I only report it if a certain threshold has been achieved by an attacker, right? They got into one user, but they didn't get, expanded beyond that. They didn't pivot. And so there's still some ambiguity around what we should be reporting. In fact, the article even goes further to suggest that only 25% of cybersecurity incidents are reported, and other kind of organizations are pegging that even lower, right? And so with this new take on regulations, how do we prepare and how do we determine what is required to share, right? And of course, we're going to be afraid of reputation. We're going to be afraid of this, but eventually, the word does get out. Oftentimes, most of the stories we read about in the news is because somebody somewhere leaks that information and says, by the way, this company was hacked. Right? They haven't mentioned it yet, but we figured we need to share that, right? So I don't know. We'll,
Yeah.
we'll definitely see.
Yeah, and I think that whole point of like figuring out what the bar is to share with, it speaks to just overall organizational maturity across the board. Because like, I've worked with our DFIR guys when a customer's having a breach, or a new customer's coming to us because of a breach. Like when we see new faces that you look at their program. I've seen an incident occur where the customer didn't have any endpoint security products rolled out, like, and so when you start to talk about what is the bar for what you disclose with, like, yes, we've realized that something was realized in this environment, but as an organization we don't have the tools to say for a fact that like we didn't observe any exfiltration, right? Like, so it's going to get very interesting. And so the alternative is like you also then go, okay, well, not only do you have to disclose when something happens, but these are the baseline controls that allow you to see that. So then, are you looking at NDR, and are you looking at what kind of data is leaving? Are you looking at additional cloud visibility? Are you looking at additional endpoint controls? Like, what does it go? And then for smaller organizations, are there levels to this? Like, if you're certain size organization, like what are the required controls once you cross this? And then you get some tapering there. So like it's very gray uh, set of problems. But I do think one thing that I would say is there should be a minimum bar. Like there's such a low uh, set of required things that large orgs or that organizations in general have to do. I think that kind of that incentivized behavior for large corporations is something that is it can be good, but like regulation can go one or two ways. So we'll see how we've changed. Raphael Mudge, like I think he used to do some consulting for the government, just kind of laying things together, and I think more private public interactions when it comes to these regulations, the more they open it up to security researchers, the consultants, the practitioners at large corporations and mid-sized and small corporations. I think the more feedback loop they do in that regard, the better the regulation will come out. Uh, so we'll see if they do that.
Yeah, and so this article coming to us from the Harvard Business Review does have a couple of things for considerations based on what it looks like the direction we're going in. Some of the particular calls is make sure your procedures are up to the task, right? And this has to do with defining materially what it is that your procedure is, how does it apply, and be prepared for these regulations so that you can respond effectively to them. Another one is keep ransomware policies up to date. We've talked about it a lot on the show regarding ransomware and how does your organization handle that should that day come. Hopefully it doesn't, but what is your policy on it? Do you pay that ransom? And even considerations around is regulation going to make it a crime to pay ransom? And then finally, stuff in the software bill of materials, right, or SBOM. That's a big one that I see a lot more and more on LinkedIn in conversations. And so maintaining a detailed, up-to-date software bill of materials so that you can understand those different pieces, right? And this all kind of rolls back to that open source bug bounty thing that we kind of kicked it off with, which is, do you have the slightest clue of what's going on in your organization? And oftentimes the answer is kinda. And so, I think everybody, big and small, when it comes to company size, should be at least staying on top of this stuff and understanding what's coming down the pipeline and the implications and how that affects your business, right? And all the different intricacies that you're going to be required to follow, especially if you are already dealing with some of this stuff for a publicly traded company, right? You mentioned Sarbanes-Oxley, and when we were talking before the show, and so I'm excited to see what comes up on the horizon. But I think we really hit our mark this week. This is fantastic topics to cover. What do you think?
Yeah,
It was
man, it's always
good.
good to be, man. I think I always these articles are always interesting because I think like the world's changing around us, and it's always good to kind of just sit back and kind of reflect on some of those changes every now and then.
Well, I hope the folks from the Hire a Hacker go do the right thing and do the open source bug bounty and get paid in a better fashion, so that when we come to cyber regulations, we're all following the rules. And so I think with that, we'll wrap up for this week of GPS Live for the week of September 2nd, 2022. Again, my name is Jonathan Singer.
I'm Felix Simmons.
And thank you, everybody online tuning in. And in the future, have fun, enjoy, and stay safe. Thank you.